In this final lecture concerning the solver function, we are going to find the cost of equity capital using the dividend discount models. The idea behind the dividend discount model is that share price of a company should be equal to all the future cash flows that we receive from the share. So this is the basic valuation model in finance. The real question is, why do we buy a share? And the answer should be that we buy shares to get some returns. Then the second question is, if we buy shares to get returns, how much should we pay for it? What is the price of a share? In finance, we call it intrinsic value. And the answer should be that we should pay as much as the share will give us from today till infinity. All the returns that it can give us, the share price should be equal to that amount. So if you want to write that in some equation, we will write that the price of the share is equal to all future cash flows from that share. Okay, this should be the guiding principle for developing an equation for share price valuation. If we look at the equation, it talks about future cash flows. And there are two problems with future cash flows. The first one is that it faces uncertainty. In other words, there is some risk associated with future cash flows. So the investor's utility function is negatively affected by risk. In simple words, investors do not prefer uncertainty. And wherever there is uncertainty, investors would like to pay less price for a share. So if there are two shares, one is more volatile, more risky, and the second one is less risky, the investor would like to pay higher price for the less risky stocks. In simple words, dividends or cash flows that have an element of uncertainty, they are valued less. The second problem, let me write down the first problem with the first problem is future cash flows have an element of uncertainty. In other words, they have an element of risk. And the second problem is that we have inflation. So a dollar today is worth more than a dollar that we receive in the future. So the more we go into the distant future, the lesser that cash flow becomes in value. So investor would like to pay less price if they are facing more inflation. Due to these two reasons, and third one, there is also a third reason, that is the cost of not having something today. There is sacrifice. In other words, if there is no risk present, means that some government has promised with you that it will pay the cash flows in future, and it also says that there will be no inflation at all. Still, if you are giving your money to somebody or to that government, then you must wait, let's say 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, in order to get your money back. That puts you in some sort of situation where you have to wait to get your money back. And it means that you are delaying your consumption for some time of period. In other words, you are making a sacrifice. There must be some compensation for that sacrifice. So for these three factors, the future cash flows are not valued, or they do not have the same value as a cash flow that you receive today, which means we have to make modification to the above equation. So the price of a share is not simply equal to all future cash flows from the share. Instead, we can modify the equation like this: the price of a share is equal to present value of all future cash flows. And the present value, how do we get the present value of a share? We get the present value by dividing the future cash flows on some discount rate, on some sort of rate that takes care of the three factors that we discussed right now. So we can write the equation for share prices like this: price of a share is equal to cash flows. Let's say we call it cash flows, and we discount the cash flow on some rate, and this rate takes care of the three problems. So the rate becomes higher if there is more risk, the rate becomes higher if there is more inflation, and the rate becomes higher if there is more sacrifice, means if we have to wait for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. So we have modified the equation number 1 we have modified equation number 1 like this. We call it equation number 2. Okay. So now the third question is, we have to further modify this equation. The third question is, how do we get the future cash flows? What are the methods or assumptions about future cash flows? And the answer is not simple, because future is uncertain. We do not know enough about future. So forecasting the future cash flow is a difficult task. To simplify the forecasting process, researchers have made several assumptions. So we can go by these assumptions about future cash flows. There are several models which we can use based on these assumptions. The first model, we call it perpetual growth. So, or we can say no growth. There is no growth in the dividends. First of all, let's discuss why I'm using the word dividends. If you have a share price, then if you have a share of a company, can I ask what sort of cash flow do you receive from that share? So normally we get two types of returns from holding a share. The first one is the dividend that we receive periodically from the company, and the second one is capital gain if we sell the share. Now in all these models, let's assume that we do not sell the share. We assume that we never sell the share. So if you are not going to sell the share, then the only cash flow you receive from that share would be dividends. So equation number 2, we can replace the cash flow with dividends. Instead of cash flow, we can write dividends. Now coming towards the assumptions about future cash flows, our first model is no growth in the dividends. So assume that there are certain companies which are now mature and they don't see any growth in their earnings. We can assume that their dividends will remain constant. So if a company is paying 2 rupees dividend today, what will be the dividend it will pay in the next year if there is no growth in the dividends? Of course, the same amount, it will be 2 rupees. And what will be the amount of dividend in the second year? Of course, if there is no growth, it will remain the same, 2 rupees. And for any number of periods, we can forecast this amount. It remains 2 rupees. So it becomes very simple. If there is no growth in the dividends, today's dividend is equal to the future dividend. In this case, the dividend discount model becomes very easy. We can very easily find the share price of this company. So if the price of the company, the market price of the company is not given, we can find it by dividing the dividend per share on the discount rate that we have. So assume that the dividend per share is 2 rupees and the discount rate of this company is 0.1, 10%. The price of this company is equal to 20 rupee per share. Simple. Okay, now we come towards the second model, that is the constant growth model. And in this model, we assume that the growth rate in the dividend is constant. In other words, the dividends of the company increase at the same rate for the future. So if the growth rate is 2%, we assume that the dividend will grow at 2% each year. This assumption might make sense for those companies which produce necessities, which produce items that increases, or it produces products that have a demand which increases with the rate of population. So if the population increases, the demand for that product increases. So in this model, we adjust the growth formula we adjust the dividend discount model by adding the growth variable in that. So the model becomes price of the share is equal to cash flows, that is dividend, today multiplied by 1 plus growth rate. And we also adjust the growth rate by subtracting the growth rate from it. So how do we explain this equation? The dividend that we receive today, it will grow in the next period by this amount. So if the growth rate is 10% and today's dividend is 10 rupees, next year we shall receive 11 because it will increase by a factor of 10%. And this growth rate also reduces the cost of capital. So we deduct the growth rate from that. So this is our second model, constant growth model. Our third model, the dividend discount models, the third one is called the multi-stage growth model. So the dividend increase in stages. And in this case, when the company, this is specifically true for those companies which enter the market right now. So in the first stage, the dividends and the earnings of the company increases at a higher rate, and then either it becomes constant growth company or zero growth company. So we divide the cash flows of the company into two stages. In the first stage, the company has a higher growth rate, and in the second stage, the company either faces the zero growth or constant growth. So if you want to write the equation for this company, it will be something like this. So we have divided the dividends into two steps. The step 1, where the growth rate is random, we discount the dividends one by one. So in year 1 we have dividends and we discount it separately. In year 2 we have against different dividend, we discount it separately. And from year 3 and onwards, the dividend have let's say it has shifted to a constant growth model. So the third year dividend plus terminal value. Terminal value means that all future dividends will have this value. So how do we find the terminal value? The terminal value comes from the let's say the company faces a constant growth model. So from we will put the constant growth model for the terminal value. If the company faces no growth model, then we will put the no growth value as the terminal value. So we find the terminal value separately. We find once we find its value, we put it there with the third dividend and discount them collectively. So these are the three models for dividends. I'll take a break of 5 minutes and then we will have practice on these. Thank you.